Welcome to Light of Life, where we look at the world in our own lives through a Christian lens. Today's topic is Marco Rubio's speech at the National Prayer Jubilee, the deep, soulful cry and realignment of America's national soul.
It's quite a title, isn't it?
It really is. And to get us started, I want you to just picture this. It is May 17th, 2026.
Right.
And you are standing shoulder to shoulder with, literally tens of thousands of people right in the middle of the National Mall in Washington, D.C.
Just a massive crowd.
Yeah, massive. And it's loud. You know, the wind's catching the Star-Spangled Banner above you. But right next to it, like everywhere you look, Christian flags are snapping in the breeze as well.
Which is definitely not your standard Tuesday afternoon tourist crowd in D.C.
Exactly. I mean, people have traveled from every single corner of the country for this. And the entire reason you and, everyone else are standing there is to watch this massive video address delivered by Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
Right, for an event billed as Rededicate 250 National Prayer Jubilee.
Yes. And what we're doing today, what this deep dive is all about, is kind of ripping the hood off this moment. We're going to deconstruct the profound and honestly highly controversial theological framework that drove all those people to the mall in the first place.
Yeah, and before we get a single step further into this, we really need to lay down our analytical ground rules for today.
Oh, definitely. That's crucial.
Because we are dealing with source material, today specifically, a detailed account of this 2026 Jubilee and Secretary Rubio's speech that is, well, it's heavily charged.
Very charged.
Right. It's politically charged, it's culturally charged, and it touches on some incredibly raw nerves regarding secularism, the culture wars, and how we fundamentally interpret American history.
Yeah, it hits all the hot button issues.
Exactly. So I want to be crystal clear with you, our listener. Our goal in this deep dive is to act purely as impartial analysts.
Right, we're just looking at the mechanics of the argument.
Yes. We are not here to endorse a political side, and we aren't, adopting any specific ideology. Our entire mission is to impartially unpack the claims, the historical interpretations, and those really deep theological arguments presented by the text and the speakers at the event.
We just want to understand how they view the timeline of the United States.
Exactly.
Because the core argument being made here is that the United States isn't just a geopolitical entity.
Right.
They're arguing it is a spiritual project. The author of our source material is linking 250 years of history to this ancient biblical concept of a covenant.
And that implies a very specific relationship.
Yeah, and because of that, they are demanding a very specific structural, spiritual realignment. And the way they build this argument, it actually starts with the calendar.
The date is super intentional.
Right. It's not an accident that this massive gathering took place on May 17th, 2026. The text immediately forces us to look backward exactly 250 years to May 17th, 1776.
Yeah, and that date is basically the linchpin for their entire historical narrative.
Because normally we don't think about May 1776.
No, not at all. When we think of 1776, our brains just automatically default to July 4th, right?
Fireworks, Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson.
Exactly. But what the speakers at this Jubilee focus on is what happened 2 months earlier, in May, inside the Second Continental Congress. They passed this resolution that explicitly called on the 13 colonies to observe a national day of fasting and prayer.
Which is wild when you think about what was happening right then.
It is. And to understand why the author focuses on this, you really have to understand the sheer terror of May 1776.
Oh, absolutely.
The colonies were, frankly, a loosely organized, chaotic mess. They were staring down the barrel of the British Empire, which, possessed the most lethal, well-funded military machine on Earth.
And they had absolutely zero guarantee they were going to survive this.
None.
I think it's really easy for us sitting here centuries later to view the revolution as this inevitable triumph. We know how the movie ends.
Right, we know they win.
But the source material pulls a quote from Benjamin Franklin that Rubio actually highlights in his speech. Franklin basically says, "We must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately."
And he wasn't being metaphorical there.
No, he was being literal. If they lost, they were traitors to the crown. The punishment was the gallows. It was basically a mass suicide pact if the war failed.
Yeah, and the argument the source material is making is that in this exact moment of existential dread, when annihilation seemed, honestly, entirely probable, the founders didn't just panic.
Right.
the Continental Congress issued a resolution stating that they needed to, and I quote, "with true repentance and most earnest worship, openly acknowledge the governing providence of Almighty God."
Wow.
Yeah, the author really wants us to see that this was not some ceremonial box-checking exercise. It was a desperate, profound spiritual conviction.
But, let me challenge that framing for a second, or at least put a spotlight on it, because this is where the text starts demanding a major shift in how we view history. Well, normally, when a nation is staring down an invading army, the very first instinct is material, right?
Right, you build defenses.
Exactly. You forge iron, you stockpile gunpowder, you count your militia. But the author is insisting here that the founders' initial mobilization was spiritual.
Yeah, they prioritize the fast.
So, if I can throw an analogy at this, think about preparing a ship to sail directly into, a Category 5 hurricane.
Okay.
The natural instinct is to batten down the hatches, secure the rigging, check the hull, all that physical stuff.
Sure.
But if you haven't calibrated the ship's compass, none of that structural integrity actually matters because you have no true north. You'll survive the initial winds only to be hopelessly lost at sea.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. What this text is arguing is that the founders viewed acknowledging the sovereignty of God as their compass calibration. It was the absolute baseline requirement before they even bothered tying down the rigging.
Yeah, that analogy tracks perfectly with Rubio's core thesis in his speech. He argues that this reliance on divine providence wasn't just a momentary survival tactic in 1776.
It didn't just end there.
No. He says it became the genetic code of the nation. He makes this massive, sweeping claim that America has been more profoundly shaped by Christian thought than any other nation in history.
Which is a huge claim to make.
It's massive. And the author of our source doesn't just let that claim hang in the air either. They back it up by dropping 3 very specific historical anchors to prove that this compass calibration, as you called it, is the recurring theme of the American experiment.
And I really want to dig into these 3 anchors because they are incredibly vivid in the text.
You really are.
So the first one takes us back long before the Revolution. It's 1630. We are on the deck of this wooden ship called the Arbella, just tossing around in the Atlantic Ocean.
A terrifying journey on its own.
Exactly. And John Winthrop is delivering a sermon to this group of Puritans who are heading to a completely untamed continent. The sermon is called A Model of Christian Charity.
Right.
And it contains arguably the most famous phrase in American political history. We must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us.
And politicians have used that phrase for decades,
Yeah.
right? Usually to describe American exceptionalism.
Yeah, exactly. Ronald Reagan, JFK, everyone uses it. But the source material makes a hard pivot here. It insists that when Winthrop said city upon a hill, he absolutely did not mean it as a metaphor.
And this is perhaps the most vital theological distinction in the entire document.
Because a metaphor is just poetry.
Right, a metaphor is poetic. A covenant, though, is legally and spiritually binding. The author is diving really deep into Puritan covenant theology here.
Break that down a bit for us.
We have to remember these Puritans were fleeing a European system that was built on the divine right of kings.
Right, where the king is chosen by God.
Exactly. The monarch answered to God, and the cousins just answered to the monarch. There was a hierarchy. But the Puritans flipped that entirely.
Okay.
They believed they were entering into a direct, collective contract with the Creator. The source argues that they genuinely believed they were a chosen people.
And what were the terms of that contract?
Basically, that if they built a society based on justice and biblical principles, God would bless them. But, and this is the terrifying part of the covenant, if they became greedy, corrupt, and turned away from God, they believed God's wrath would literally wipe them off the map.
Man. Right, so it's a two-way street, but with lethal consequences.
Very lethal.
If you fail to be that moral model, you don't just lose an election or have a bad economy, you break a divine contract. That is an incredibly heavy psychological burden for an entire society to carry.
Exactly. And the author traces that exact same psychological and spiritual burden forward to a completely different era for the second anchor, which is 1844.
Okay, so we're jumping forward about 200 years.
Right. We move from a freezing wooden ship on the Atlantic to a bustling telegraph office.
Quite the scene change.
It is. Samuel Morse is about to send the first long-distance telegraph message.
Which is a huge deal.
Think about the gravity of this moment. Up until then, human beings had been entirely limited by the speed of a horse or a ship for communication.
Right. If you wanted to send a message, it physically had to be carried.
Exactly. And Morse is about to instantly annihilate distance. He is staring down the barrel of a technology that will literally shrink the globe.
And he can choose any words in the English language to mark this dawn of modern telecommunications.
Anything at all.
And he doesn't quote Shakespeare. He doesn't, praise human ingenuity or talk about science. The text points out that he quotes Numbers 23.23, "What hath God wrought?"
Yes, and the text emphasizes this specifically to show that even at the height of the Industrial Revolution, at this moment of supreme human technological triumph, the foundational instinct was deep biblical awe.
He's giving the credit to God.
Exactly. Morse isn't saying, "Look what I built." He is framing this massive leap forward as a revelation of the Creator's power.
Which leads perfectly into the third anchor the text uses. And this one is just staggering in its visual contrast. It's 1968.
No, this one gives you chills.
It really does. The Apollo 8 astronauts are the first human beings to ever leave low Earth orbit, cross the void of space, and orbit the moon.
Right.
But, context is everything here, because 1968 was a brutal year in America.
It was incredibly volatile.
Yeah, you had the Vietnam War raging, you had the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, you had cities literally burning during riots.
A country tearing itself apart.
Exactly. And then on Christmas Eve, 1 billion people tune in to hear a broadcast from a tin can floating 240,000 miles away.
And what do the astronauts do with the attention of the entire world in that chaotic moment?
Right.
They don't give a sterile scientific report. They don't talk about the engineering.
No.
They read the opening sequence of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.
It's just so powerful.
It is. And what the author of our source material is doing, by stacking these three moments, 1630, 1844, and 1968, is synthesizing a massive historical argument.
And Rubio uses this too, right?
Yes. Rubio's thesis is that Christian faith is what fundamentally freed Americans from the stagnant cycles of ancient empires. It gave them the audacity to pioneer the complete unknown.
Whether that meant sailing across the lethal ocean, rewiring human communication, or strapping themselves to a rocket and firing it at the moon.
Exactly.
I really want to look at how these three moments function together, though, because it's not just a timeline the author is presenting.
Right, it's deeper than that.
If I can try another analogy here, it's kind of like looking at the genetic code of a living organism.
Okay, I fell.
Like if you look at a skin cell under a microscope, and then look at a brain cell, and then a muscle cell, visually, they have absolutely nothing in common. They do completely different jobs.
Right.
A wooden ship, a telegraph machine, a Saturn V rocket, completely different.
Very different forms.
But if you sequence the DNA inside those cells, you find the exact same biological instruction set running the whole show.
Oh, it's good.
What this text is arguing is that the covenant Winthrop talked about is the spiritual DNA of America. Whether you are in 1630 or 1968, the exact same instruction set is operating in the background.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize the author's argument.
Okay.
They are insisting this faith wasn't just like a private hobby for Morse or the astronaut.
Right, it wasn't just a personal preference.
No, it was the operating system of the country itself. But if we follow this logic, it brings us to a really critical juncture in the text, which is the title of the event itself, Rededicate 250, subtitled The National Prayer Jubilee.
Right, because Jubilee is a very specific word.
Yes. The author spends a significant amount of time unpacking the mathematics of faith here, because the word Jubilee isn't just, a catchy branding term they came up with for a poster.
No, the math here is wild. I was looking at this, and the text specifically grounds this in Leviticus 25.10.
Yeah.
Can you break down the mechanics of what a Jubilee actually was in ancient Israel? Because reading the text, it's clear it wasn't just a church service. It was a radical economic and social mechanism.
Oh, it was incredibly radical. So in ancient Israelite law, God commanded a Sabbath year every 7 years. During that year, the land was left to rest. No planting, no harvesting.
Which takes a lot of trust.
Huge amounts of faith. You basically lived on faith that God would provide enough in the 6th year to carry you through the 7th.
Right.
Now count out 7 of those Sabbath cycles. 7 times 7 is 49 years.
Okay, doing the math.
Leviticus mandates that in the 50th year you sound the trumpet, and that 50th year is a jubilee.
Okay.
So the math the text presents for the year 2026 is exact. A jubilee is 50 years. Therefore, the 250th anniversary of the United States is exactly 5 jubilees.
50 times 5.
Right. And the author treats this not as like a neat calendar coincidence, but as divine, inescapable rhythm.
Okay, but I have to stop you and ask about the practical application of this. Because what is the fundamental difference between an anniversary and a jubilee?
That's the million-dollar question.
All right, because culturally, an anniversary is totally passive. We say, happy 250th anniversary, America. We survived. Let's have a parade, grill some hot dogs, shoot off some fireworks, and go back to work on Monday.
Exactly. Business as usual.
But the way the source material frames it, a jubilee is an active, aggressive, almost violently disruptive reset.
Disruptive is exactly the right word. An anniversary celebrates the past. A jubilee structurally alters the present.
How so?
Well, if we look at how the Jubilee functioned in Leviticus, which the text relies heavily upon to make its point, it meant a total reset of the society. All leased land was returned to its original ancestral owners.
Wow, just handed back?
Just handed back. If someone had sold themselves into servitude to pay off a debt, they were freed. All debts were wiped clean across the board.
That's a massive societal upheaval.
It is. So what does that mean in the context of Marco Rubio's speech and this massive gathering on the National Mall?
Right. What are they asking for?
The author is arguing that a nation cannot just celebrate its triumphs after 250 years. It must initiate a total spiritual and societal reset.
Okay.
It means returning the property of the nation's sovereignty back to its original owner, which the text identifies as the creator.
So it's essentially saying the 50-year lease is up. It's time to hand the keys back to the landlord and let him fix the plumbing.
Yes, exactly. And we see this perfectly illustrated in the source material's description of House Speaker Mike Johnson's role at the event.
Right. He led a prayer, didn't he?
He led the rededication prayer. And the timeline he uses in that prayer is fascinating because he doesn't just start the clock at 1776.
Where does he start?
The text notes that Johnson traced the spiritual lineage all the way back to Christopher Columbus sailing toward the New World.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then to the settlers at Jamestown, planting a wooden cross at Cape Henry in 1607, and then to the Pilgrims' Covenant at Plymouth.
So he's going way back.
Right. He is establishing a continuous chain of title, so to speak, and it culminates in him, alongside tens of thousands of people, formally declaring the rededication of the U.S. as one nation under God.
But this naturally begs a massive question, doesn't it?
What's that?
If a jubilee demands a total system reboot, if you are going through the excruciating process of resetting the entire machine, it implies that the machine is currently deeply broken.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, you don't perform a factory reset on a smartphone if it's running perfectly.
You only do it when it's crashing.
Exactly. And this pivots the entire document directly into a brutally blunt diagnosis of present-day America.
And let me tell you, the diagnosis the text offers is severe.
It doesn't hold back.
Not at all. The author talks about confronting a painful reality. The claim is that America has drifted so far from the spiritual DNA we just talked about, you know, the DNA of the Arbella, the telegraph, the moon landing, that the nation is becoming unrecognizable to its original design.
And the text gives a very specific list of grievances, right?
It does. It provides a litany of what it calls the secular shift.
Right.
It points to prayer being stripped out of public schools. It highlights crosses being legally mandated to be removed from public parks and spaces.
It mentions foundational values, too.
Yeah, it argues that foundational biblical values, which were once the absolute bedrock of the legal system, are now openly mocked in the public square as outdated prejudices.
Okay, hold on. Let's inject some real-world friction into this, because I'm looking at this list of grievances, taking crosses out of parks, getting prayer back in schools.
Sure.
If a secular skeptic, or frankly even just a moderate listener, is tuning into this analysis, they are going to hear that list and say, wait a minute, this Rededicate 250 thing isn't a prayer meeting.
They'll see it as political.
Exactly. They'll say, this is Christian nationalism. This is a highly orchestrated right-wing political rally dressed up in Sunday clothes to stoke the culture wars.
Right.
So how does the author of this text defend against the accusation that this event is just partisan weaponization of religion?
That is the exact tension that runs beneath the surface of this entire document. It's a crucial challenge to address.
Yeah, because it's the obvious critique.
Right. Well, the author defends the gathering by pointing out exactly where the critique is aimed.
What do you mean?
If this were purely a political rally, all the anger and blame would be projected entirely outward.
Right, at the secularists, at the other political party.
Exactly, at secularists, at politicians, at the culture. But the text does something highly subversive here. It actually turns the weapon inward.
Inward toward the attendees.
Yes. The author writes that the most alarming part of the secular shift isn't what Hollywood or Washington is doing. It is the wavering within the church itself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The text explicitly accuses modern Christians of putting cultural trends above biblical authority, of quietly compromising their theology just to fit in with the times.
So the primary target of the frustration is actually the people standing on the mall, not just the people outside of it.
Precisely. The text anchors this whole event in a very specific scripture, 2 Chronicles 7.14.
Which says what?
It says, "If my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray."
If my people.
Notice it doesn't say if the pagans humble themselves or if the politicians humble themselves.
Right.
It says, if my people. The text insists that Rededicate 250 was not a political performance or a pitchfork mob aimed at secular society. It frames it as a national act of confession and deep introspection.
It's taking ownership of the decay.
Exactly. And this leads directly into Marco Rubio's core warning in his speech.
Right.
The text notes that his speech was actually devoid of standard partisan attacks, but it was filled with what we could call structural anxiety.
Structural anxiety, okay.
His thesis is that the United States was built upon the fear of God. If you remove that foundational reverence, then everything built on top of it, the freedom, the economic prosperity, the civil rights, loses its load-bearing wall.
So the whole thing just comes down.
Right. He uses the biblical metaphor of a house built on sand. When the storms of history eventually come, a secularized America will simply collapse under its own weight because the foundation is gone.
And the text brings in some specific scriptures to back this up, right?
It does. It highlights 2 scriptures Rubio leaned on. Proverbs 14.34, which says, "Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people."
Right.
And Psalm 33.12, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord."
So the mechanics here are strictly causal.
Yes. God is the cause, national stability is the effect.
You know, that structural anxiety makes a lot of sense if you accept their premise, but diagnosing a crumbling foundation is the easy part, right?
Sure is.
The text can't just yell that the sky is falling and then end the event. They need a plan.
And they have one.
Right. This brings us to the prescription. The text lays out 3 actionable pillars for Christians today. It pivots this whole Jubilee concept from a massive, sweeping national event down to an urgent individual calling.
Yes, it gets very personal.
So, if Pillar 1 is about changing what's in your head, what does the text actually say we have to do?
Let's break them down because they are demanding.
Okay.
Pillar 1 is acknowledge God's sovereignty.
Which sounds simple, but
the text asks a very pointed question. In the face of all this current social upheaval, do Christians instinctively rely on political maneuvering, or do they seek God's face first?
that's convicting.
The implication here is heavy. The author is suggesting that a vast majority of modern American Christians have actually traded spiritual reliance for political reliance.
They're looking to Washington instead of heaven.
Exactly. They care more about who is in the Oval Office than who is on the throne of heaven. Acknowledging sovereignty means fundamentally shifting your trust away from human institutions.
Which, let's be honest, is incredibly hard to do in an election year.
Oh, almost impossible.
But moving to Pillar 2, this is where the rubber really meets the road. Pillar 2 is live out a city upon a hill.
Going back to Winthrop.
Right. And the text references Jesus in Matthew 5:14, "You are the light of the world."
Yes.
But does the text actually explain how we are supposed to do that? Because, live out justice sounds great on a bumper sticker, but it's incredibly vague in practice.
The text actually does provide a sharp contrast to explain the how. It explicitly states that this light shouldn't just be slogans and protests.
Okay, so it's anti-performative.
Exactly. The author is offering a critique of modern activism here. Today, showing you care about a cause usually means posting on social media, holding a sign, or yelling at someone you disagree with.
Right, it's very loud.
But the text argues that true spiritual influence operates completely differently. It insists that love for the nation must be shown through the quiet, grueling practice of justice, mercy, and humility in everyday life.
Just doing the hard work quietly.
Yes. The argument is that living a life of profound integrity emits what it calls the fragrance of Christ, which acts as a beacon in the dark far more effectively than a political argument ever could.
So it's really about substance over signaling.
Beautifully put. Yes.
And that brings us to Pillar 3, which, honestly, I find to be the most fascinating mechanism in the entire text. Pillar 3 is become watchmen in prayer.
Yeah. This one is deep.
The author pulls this from Ezekiel 33:7, where God tells the prophet, "Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel."
Right.
Explain how this spiritual mechanism of a watchman practically operates in the modern world according to this text.
Well, in the ancient world, a watchman stood on the city wall at night.
Like a guard.
Exactly. While everyone else slept, their entire job was to stare into the darkness and look for incoming threats.
Right.
They're looking for an invading army, a fire, bandits, whatever. If they saw danger, they blew the trumpet to wake everyone up. If they fell asleep, the city died.
The stakes were ultimate.
Yes. And the text is applying this directly to the believers at this Jubilee. It is saying that God calls them to be the spiritual watchmen for the nation, praying day and night.
Let me try a modern analogy for this because I think it really helps clarify the stakes here.
Go for it.
Think about the human immune system. A watchman isn't just a brick wall passively sitting there.
Yeah, they're active.
A watchman is like the T cells in your bloodstream.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. Most of your body cells are just doing their daily jobs, pumping blood, digesting food, whatever. But the T cells are constantly patrolling the perimeter.
Looking for invaders.
Exactly. They are actively looking for microscopic anomalies, for viruses, for threats that the rest of the body can't even perceive yet.
Right.
And if they find one, they sound the alarm and attack it before the whole body gets sick. The author is essentially telling this crowd, you are the T cells for the soul of America.
That is a very demanding calling.
It requires constant, exhausting vigilance, and it requires you to focus entirely outward to protect the community.
That biological analogy captures the absolute necessity of the role perfectly. A society without watchmen is like a body with no immune system. It will eventually succumb to a disease it never saw coming. And how these three pillars, shifting trust to God, living with quiet integrity, and patrolling the spiritual perimeter, how they all culminate in real time, is found in the final act of the event.
Prayer at the end.
Yes, the text provides the full transcript of the Jubilee Restoration Prayer, which was prayed over them all. It really serves as a microcosm of everything the author has been arguing.
Let's deconstruct that prayer because it is essentially the emotional and theological climax of this entire historical narrative we've been tracking.
It ties it all together.
It does, and it has a very intentional structure. It starts with gratitude.
Right.
And it doesn't just say, thanks for a nice country. It weaves all the history we just talked about right into the modern plea.
Which is very powerful.
Yeah. It thanks God for answering the desperate, terrified cries of the Continental Congress 250 years ago. It thanks God for giving the city upon a hill vision to Winthrop, for Samuel Morse's technological awe, for the Apollo 8 astronauts reading Genesis in the vacuum of space.
It forces the crowd to realize they are standing on the shoulders of these specific moments.
Yes. The prayer violently compresses time, basically. It makes 1630 feel like it happened yesterday.
It does. And then, crucially, the prayer pivots into confession.
Right, the inward look.
Exactly. Again, aligning with that inward-looking posture we discussed, it doesn't blame the atheists or the politicians. The prayer openly confesses the twisting of holy teachings by the church itself.
Wow.
It repents for replacing deep spiritual wisdom with shallow worldly wisdom, and it laments that the church has lost its first love.
Which is a biblical reference.
Yes, it is a stunning moment of taking collective responsibility for a generational failure.
And finally, it shifts into the petition. This is where they ask for the Jubilee reset.
The actual ask.
Right. They ask for leaders whose hearts actually fear God, not just poll numbers.
Which is a big distinction.
And I found this part deeply moving. They specifically pray to tear down dividing walls to end partisan division.
They aren't asking to win a political fight.
No, they aren't praying for their political party to crush the other side. They're praying for unity. And they ask God to fulfill the ancient promises of the Levitical Jubilee.
Right, the releasing of debts.
Yes, to release those who are captive to addiction or despair, to restore the moral foundations that were taken, and to heal the land.
It is a sweeping, comprehensive plea.
It really is.
If we step back and look at the sheer scale of the journey this text has taken us on, it's monumental.
Yeah, let's summarize where we've been.
We started by examining the sheer terror and the spiritual compass calibration of the Continental Congress in May 1776.
Great.
We traced how that specific covenant theology propelled American milestones, from the Puritans on the Arbella to to the dawn of the telegraph, to the orbit of the moon.
All connected by that same spiritual DNA.
Exactly. Then we dug into the radical economic and spiritual mechanics of an ancient jubilee and how they apply to a 250-year-old superpower.
The 50-year reset.
Right. And finally, we unpacked the severe diagnosis of secular drift and the urgent, inward-focused demand for repentance and realignment that drove tens of thousands of people to Washington in 2026.
You know, it is an incredible framework to view history through, regardless of where you stand politically.
It truly is. And the author leaves the reader with a highly provocative thought to wrestle with at the end.
What's that?
The text asks us to project ourselves into the future. When historians look back at this exact day, May 17, 2026, how will they write about it?
Oh, that's interesting.
Will they view this Rededicate 250 Jubilee as a mere footnote? Just, a quaint, nostalgic gathering of people who prayed on the Mall and then went home, changing absolutely nothing about the trajectory of the nation.
A blip on the radar.
Right. Or will future generations look back at that exact date and identify it as the inflection point?
A moment everything changed.
Exactly. The exact moment when the tectonic plates shifted, when a massive segment of the population actually initiated a jubilee and fundamentally turned the ship of state back to its original true north.
Man, that is a staggering historical question. And realistically, we won't know the answer for decades.
No, we won't.
But for you, our listener, we want to take these massive national concepts and bring them right to your front door. So how do you think the concept of a jubilee, a total reset and realignment, could apply not just to a nation, but to our everyday lives? Please subscribe to this channel, like it, and leave a comment. See you next time.
On this day, 2.5 centuries ago, our forefathers gathered for the second time in as many years for a national day of fasting and prayer. The resolution of the Continental Congress called on the 13 colonies to humble themselves in preparation for the coming war, with true penitence of heart and the most reverent devotion publicly to acknowledge the overruling providence of God. In 3.5 months' time, the colonists would be in open revolt against the most powerful empire in the history of the world. Many, on both sides of the Atlantic, thought their cause was a suicide mission. The founders were not naive men. They knew their lives were on the line. That was the premise of Benjamin Franklin's dark joke after signing the Declaration of Independence, where he said, "We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly, we shall all hang separately." They had no guarantees of victory. They knew that what they were trying to do had never been done before in human history. But with the dark storm clouds of war looming on the horizon, they did what Christians have always done, across place and time for 2,000 years. They turned their eyes to heaven and placed their fate in the hands of God. It is no coincidence that America, from the very beginning, has occupied a unique and exceptional place in world history. Before the Christian West, most societies, and civilizations for that matter, thought in stagnant cycles: the flooding of the Nile, the return of the rains, the cycle of the harvest. History, for them, was a wheel to nowhere. It turned and turned only to end up back where it began. But our faith calls us outwards into the limitless darkness of the unknown. It tells us to go forth and preach the gospel to the world as a witness unto all nations, unto the ends of the earth. From that command came America. Our nation, more than any other in history, was shaped by this Christian idea. We saw it at work already in 1630, more than a century before the Revolution, when John Winthrop stood on the deck of the Arabella in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and preached a sermon to his fellow Puritan colonists. "We shall be as a city upon a hill," he told them. "The eyes of all people are upon us." That same faith pushed America further to new frontiers. It was the engine of westward expansion. Who will respond to the call from beyond the Rocky Mountains, one reverend wrote in a public message to the American churches in 1833, calling for a wave of missionaries to leave the comforts of civilization and spread the gospel in the wilderness. Countless Americans answered that call. It was the same faith that was at work when Samuel Morse sent the first long-distance telegraph message in 1844. His message was a verse from the book of Numbers: "What hath God wrought?" And on Christmas Eve of 1968, 3 American astronauts orbited the moon. They were the first men in history to witness an Earthrise from lunar orbit, to look back at the blue marble of our home from 250,000 miles away. the world was watching. It was the largest television audience in the history of the world up to that point. And what did they say? They opened the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is who we are. It is who we have always been. America is still a young nation measured against the record of history. And from the beginning, we have carried the belief that our country represents something new in the world. But the soul of our nation has always been rooted in an ancient faith